I got my start doing human trafficking research more than 25 years ago, back when most of us knew almost nothing about it. Now, at that time, all the information that we had came from some scattered reporting and collections of survivor interviews. And I came across one of those collections as a sophomore in college, and honestly, it was shocking. These were stories from Southeast Asia of young girls who had experienced exploitation like I couldn't have even imagined. It would have been impossible for any human being to read that and not feel compelled to do something, and I felt that really deeply. Now, I wasn't naive enough to think I could fix a problem like trafficking. I was barely 20 years old, and I didn't know anything about anything, and I knew that. But at the same time, I felt like I couldn't turn away, like I wanted to find a way to help. I wanted to find a role that I could play toward a solution, even if it was a small role. To do that, I knew I had a lot to learn. And this was the late 90s, we didn't have Google. So to learn, the only way to learn was to jump all the way in. So that's what I did. When it came time to pick a senior thesis project, I went off to southwestern China. This is the part of China that borders Vietnam and Myanmar. And I started spending time in massage parlors and karaoke bars, learning about the obvious trafficking that was happening in those locations just by talking to the young women who were working there. Now, at first, we talked about regular things that teenage girls talk about, music and movies and clothes, right? I practiced my Chinese and they practiced their English, and we did a lot of karaoke together. They really loved the Backstreet Boys, which stretched my skill set in a new direction, and it was unfortunate for everybody involved. But I got to know them, and I earned their trust. And in return, they were generous with me in sharing about their experiences and about the risks that they knew that they were taking. I would ask them, where are you from? Always somewhere really far away. How did you get here? Always with the help of the bar owner or the guy who was running the massage parlor. I asked them if they were afraid, and they always had some version of the same response for me. Like it didn't matter that they were afraid because they had no other choices. There was nothing for them at home. And even if this was a risk, there had been a chance that they could earn some money and build a better life. What I learned during that first attempt at trafficking research is that there's a casual cruelty about the whole process, this widespread exploitation of those women in those massage parlors and those karaoke bars, people with very few choices and nothing to lose. And what I also learned is that trafficking is everywhere. And it's not just sex trafficking, but also labor trafficking, forced labor, and modern slavery. It is a big problem, a systemic problem, one that needs a big systemic solution. Now, my time in China changed the direction of my life. After that, I knew that I wanted to work on trafficking, and I knew I wanted to work on it from a policy perspective. So I went and got a PhD in development economics because that's a field where we can use big microdata sets to learn something about how programs and policies can help improve the lives of people in low and middle income countries. Seemed great. Except when it comes to trafficking research, that was very frustrating because we just didn't have any data. And without access to high quality data sets, it felt like we didn't have the tools that we needed to learn about prevention or how to intervene at scale. After grad school, I landed here at Stanford over in the Department of Health Policy, and I was working with Professor Grant Miller on global health issues a little bit more generally. Now, I had continued to work on trafficking on and off over the years, but I was always frustrated by this lack of data. It made it impossible to do the kind of rigorous quantitative work that I knew was needed in the field. Then in 2018, my colleague at the Center for Human Rights, Jesse Brunner, hosted a talk by a Brazilian federal labor prosecutor named Luis Assis. And I remember the talk was entitled, Using Data to Combat Human Trafficking. And I thought, obviously, my interest is piqued, right? So Grant and I went to this talk together, and we immediately saw an opportunity spark. Now, Luis had prosecuted hundreds of cases of trafficking through his career, but that's not what this talk was about. He also happened to be a data scientist, and he had this personal commitment to making Brazil's counter-trafficking efforts more data-driven. He had pulled together dozens of data sets, micro data sets on over 60,000 cases of trafficking in Brazil. And he put them together into these dashboards so that local policymakers could access and understand that data. Now, seeing this was a really big deal. These were the biggest data sets that I had ever seen on trafficking cases. So it felt really exciting to think that maybe the era of big data has finally caught up to trafficking work. right? It felt exciting to think about the opportunities that might be opening and finally being able to do those big quantitative studies I had always wanted to do. So the next year, Louise came to Stanford as a visiting scholar, and together with Grant, Jesse, and another colleague, Vicky, we formed the Stanford Human Trafficking Data Lab together. Now, our lab is focused on finding ways to adapt data science and modern AI technology to combat human trafficking, and we use the most rigorous quantitative methodologies possible in our research so that we can build an evidence base to try to figure out what works to fight trafficking and why it works. Now, in our first year, we spent a lot of time trying to understand the ground reality in Brazil. And one of the things that we learned about is that Brazil actually has a pretty big forced labor problem in the arc of deforestation. Now, that is a big zone in Brazil where the Amazon and other native forest is cleared away to make space for agricultural use, and the timber is used to make charcoal, and then that charcoal is used to make steel. So I had, of course, heard about deforestation in the Amazon. Everybody here knows about that. But I didn't know that they were turning the trees into charcoal, and I didn't know how much modern slavery is involved in that process. They're literally using slaves to turn the Amazon into charcoal. And the worst producers preyed on the most vulnerable workers, a lot of times transient workers who have very little education or literacy. They have no permanent homes and no families that can come help them, right? And it turns out it's very difficult for law enforcement to intervene in cases like this, right? Because they actually just don't know where these charcoal production sites are located, right? And without knowing where they are, it's impossible to do any kind of active monitoring. And they can't really figure out where to invest their resources. They have to wait for workers or bystanders to call in to human rights hotlines before they can act, okay? And unfortunately, these areas are extremely remote. There's probably no cell phone service, right? So it's actually very difficult for a worker to call a hotline to ask for help. And they're so isolated that there's no bystanders around that can see something is wrong and call on their behalf. And then on top of that, half of the roads aren't even mapped. So even if they could make a phone call, they have no way of describing where they're being held. They might not even know where they're being held, right? They might only know that they were driven in some general direction outside of the nearest town. So investigators will put together a task force and drive 10 hours out into the middle of nowhere, only to have to spend 2 weeks driving around just trying to physically locate the sites. And of course, these are small communities, right? So if a team of federal investigators is driving around for 2 weeks, the traffickers get word pretty quick, and they just move their work teams to another location and evade detection. It's like an impossible cat and mouse game. And in this case, the good guys are trying to catch a mouse while blindfolded. So I remember sitting in a conference room over on the other side of campus, talking to Louise about this problem and just how hard it is to figure these cases out. And we decided to look at a success story. Like, what does it look like for success in this area? Maybe we can start to think about how to replicate that. So we pulled up a case report from a task force that had rescued more than a dozen workers from conditions analogous to slavery. And remember, right on the cover page was a picture of the work site. You could see the kilns. There's big white domes all arranged in a row, in 2 rows, and then in the middle, there was piles of charcoal waiting to be trucked away. And you could even see the kilns still smoking in the photo. And something about seeing that like captured in time, you could really envision it unfolding. And then right under that photo was printed a set of GIS coordinates. So Louise and I immediately did what everybody here in Silicon Valley would do. We threw those coordinates right into Google Earth, right? Because we're a couple of looky-loos. And there it was. It was a solution. It was like one of those cartoon light bulbs went off over our heads in that little conference room, right? Because from space, these sites are clear as day. The kilns show up as little white circles, all arranged in perfect lines, right? And the charcoal in the middle doesn't reflect light in the same way that anything else does. They look very distinct from the surrounding landscape. And sometimes, you can even see the smoke in the satellite imagery. So these things are hiding in plain sight. So Louise and I looked at each other and we thought, this is a job for an algorithm, right? If we can train an algorithm to scan 1 billion YouTube videos to look for cat content, surely we can train one to find these sites, and not just one at a time, but across the entire region. We had so much energy in that moment, right? Here was an elegant solution to a really big problem. It was a solution we knew that we could build, and one that we knew we could scale. And if I'm being very honest with you, we kind of knew right away that it was going to work. So it wasn't easy. It was very slow going in the beginning, right? To train an algorithm to find a particular object, you have to first tell it what the object looks like. You need examples, right? And we didn't have any examples because we didn't know where the kilns were, right? That's the whole problem. So we had a lot of experimentation in the beginning, and we had to kind of become these digital shoe leather detectives, right? But eventually we got there, and it worked. It really worked. Like, how often does that happen, right? Right away, our model found almost 200 charcoal production sites that nobody had known existed before. And then we put all those sites onto this little interactive map so that we could show investigators where they were in relation to each other, and we could help them understand which ones had the highest risk of trafficking. And within 1 month of launching our tool, the first task force was organized to go out and investigate a big cluster of sites that our model found in an area that was known to be a trafficking hotspot. Now, my colleagues and I were actually invited to go tag along on that operation. And I admit that it felt a little bit intimidating to go out and raid some illegal charcoal kilns with half a dozen big guys with guns and bulletproof vests, right? I'm small and I don't have a gun. But it also felt deeply meaningful, right? To have a front row seat, to see one of the tools that our team built, in fact, the first tool that our team built together, out there in the world doing something real and something good. They rescued workers from trafficking at the very first work site that was investigated because of our tool. And for me, I felt a lot of hope in that moment, right? Like, maybe we won't be stuck forever. Maybe technology can finally give us a leg up in that cat and mouse game. Maybe technology can help us lift the blindfold. So in the 18 months since we launched, we have gotten to watch in real time as the tool that we built transformed the way that trafficking is investigated in that sector. And so far, 70% of the sites that our model found have gotten at least a preliminary site inspection, and there was a 10-fold increase in the number of task forces that targeted those sites. And more important than that, a 10-fold increase in the number of charcoal workers that were rescued from modern slavery. So, we haven't solved every problem, of course, but we did solve this one. And it's already making a difference in the lives of some of the most vulnerable and exploited workers. And 25 years later, I finally found a role that I can play toward a solution. Thank you.